Hello and welcome to this 10th day of Hamlet. This is a short preview video on Act 4, and I would either split this up into two discussions or two classes, or what I do sometimes is I'll share this preview. I would share something like this preview for homework. So for homework, they do like 20 minutes of watching and annotating, and then they come in. Because this chunk of the play, if you're showing a movie version of it, takes a while. So you really couldn't do a preview and a film version of this or any classwork all at once. But anyway, it's a very super dynamic, sort of all over the place act where Hamlet is captured post Polonius murder. He is sent away with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. We get his final soliloquy. We get Laertes coming to seek revenge for his father's murder, and we get this very broken girl. Also for homework, or if I had time in class, I'm sort of addicted to this Andrew Scott Hamlet. I dream of it being available in its entirety. It exists in 7 or 8 scenes on YouTube now, not complete, but sort of the 7 or 8 key scenes. This scene is extraordinary. So this is from yesterday's discussion, the last discussion, the closet scene between Gertrude and Hamlet. And it's just good, it's good for all of us to see different versions of some of these scenes, to not super get locked into Mel Gibson or Kenneth Branagh, Laurence Olivier, or whomever, David Tennant, but to know that there's just so many different ways to do this. So relatively early in Act 4, we get Claudius's obvious concern. Now, after the play within the play, we know that Claudius is concerned, that he has a sense that Hamlet is on to him, which leads Claudius to the confessional, interestingly enough. But here, he says to some servants, "I've sent to seek him and to find the body," because Hamlet had dragged the body away of Polonius. And then he just says to himself, essentially, "How dangerous is it that this man goes loose? Yet must not we put the strong law on him?" And then this line that always mystifies me: "He is loved of the distracted multitude, who like not in their judgment, but their eyes." So he's saying there the population, the regular Joe in Denmark, whoever the Joe is in Denmark, Sven, I don't know, loves him. So Hamlet has this everyman capacity, even though he's a prince. That's just really strange. So Claudius's problem is Hamlet's popularity. So how strict can he be with him? The next sentence: "To bear all smooth and even, the sudden sending him away must seem deliberate." Pause. I have to look as if I'm being thoughtful as I'm sending him away, and it can't look like I'm being angry and impulsive. Diseases desperate grown by desperate appliance are relieved, or not at all. So really interesting. We see Claudius's concerns here, and being a politician, Claudius sees the thing that needs to get done, the removal of Hamlet, but also sees the PR, the public relations implications of that he's loved of the multitude. And even though Claudius here doesn't have much use for the multitude, because they don't really judge people, they just look at them and determine whether they like them. But anyway, I just find this easy to skim over, but pretty interesting. Now, Hamlet is brought to Claudius, and in another sort of typical Hamlet conversation, but the stakes are really high now. Claudius says, "Where is Polonius?" And that's a literal question. And I'm not sure, does Claudius think Hamlet's going to give him coordinates? So Hamlet says, "At supper." And Claudius repeats, "At supper." And Hamlet says, "Not where he eats," a typical supper, "but where he is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are eating at him." So Hamlet is basically, in a really sarcastic way, saying that he's now Polonius's worm food. So it's this really, it's Hamlet's way, I would argue, of having some control in a room where he doesn't have control anymore. But anyway, pay attention to that dialogue. Now, Hamlet is sent away with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and Shakespeare does this a few times in Hamlet. He does it over and over again in all of his plays, but where he has to move a character from one place to another, and it should happen just quickly, but he adds a scene that isn't totally necessary, but that's really revelatory and interesting. Here, Hamlet comes across one of the soldiers for Fortinbras, the rival of Denmark, right? And he learns that they're going to Poland to fight for a plot of land that's not worth anything, but Fortinbras just is a fighter. So if he can't fight a war that means something, he'll fight a war that doesn't mean something. So Hamlet comes close, like face to face with a huge army off to a war where a bunch of them are going to die for no reason. And interestingly, it's that spurs his last soliloquy. So the other one that's similar to this is Hamlet seeing the player king act out mourning over Hecuba and crying, the fictitious character from Virgil. And Hamlet, what a rogue and peasant slave am I? What an ass am I? He says that this guy in a fiction and a trick of fantasy can like work up tears, and I have a real father killed and I can't do anything. So this is like a version of that, except he's not seeing actors act out war. He's seeing war. He's seeing soldiers march. So here's his speech. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. This, by the way, is Act 4, Scene 4, line 34 to 69. I use the Folger edition. And I always tell my students, listen to these previews, mark up your books a little bit, and that way when you read it on your own later, you'll be kind of grounded. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. Again, we get Hamlet using his father's ghosts metaphor of revenge being like a knife that's either dull or sharp. And then a typical Hamlet goes from maybe the personal to then philosophizing when things get uncomfortable. What is a man, if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed, a beast, no more? Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fasten us unused. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know why yet I live to say this things to do. That's his landing spot. Even if you get lost beforehand, he says, I don't know why I'm still alive, and this thing I promised to do, revenge my father's murder, still hasn't happened. I don't know. And I would put it out there, how many times does Hamlet say in a soliloquy or in public, how many times does he say, I don't know? I don't think many times. Since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. Examples, gross as earth, exhort me. Witness, and then he shifts gears from his head and philosophizing his own circumstances to the army he's watching move to a war that means nothing. Witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. That's how lack of substance this war is going to mean. It's not going to mean even what an eggshell means. Rightly, and then he has an ethics little lesson here. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel and a straw when honor's at the stake. And then he brings it back to him. Again, I'm pointing out how his thoughts move from the personal to theological, philosophical to the circumstances around him, back to the personal. Watch his mind move here. How stand I then, that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep? While to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, that this is talking about the army, right, in front of him, that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. In other words, they're going to fight for a plot of land that won't even be enough land to bury the people that die for it. And then the last two lines, which he said a bunch of times. Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. Interesting here, it's his thoughts he wants to be bloody. Hamlet always centers his own identity in his thoughts. Not surprisingly, Laertes is yet another son with a father he has to avenge the murder of his father. So we have Fortinbras, who Hamlet Sr. killed his father. We have Hamlet and Hamlet Sr., and we have Fortinbras and Laertes and Polonius. And Laertes says to Claudius, how came he dead? I'll not be juggled with. To hell allegiance. Vows to the blackest devil, conscience and grace to the profoundest pit. I dare damnation. To this point I stand, that both the worlds I give to negligence. Let come what comes, only I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father. We're just pointing out here that Laertes is not Hamlet. Later on when he and Claudius are plotting the death of Hamlet, Claudius says, well, what will you do? Like, what are you willing to do? And Laertes says, cut his throat in the church. And Claudius doesn't realize he's lucky that Hamlet doesn't think that, right? Then one of the strangest, most moving and sad moments in the play, Ophelia comes out and we're reminded that people react to their families' deaths differently. I'm just, from the point of view of if you're leading a discussion group, if you're a teacher, it's real easy when teaching something like Hamlet to make it an intellectual exercise only, because the ideas in it are so interesting. But here also are two kids who are very different, who've lost both of their parents now. Laertes' response is anger and vengeance and wanting to avenge his father's murder. Ophelia breaks from the inside out. So Ophelia says, she says a lot of things. Read these pages closely because they're really interesting. And she says, I hope all will be well. We must be patient, but I cannot choose but weep to think they should lay him in the cold ground, talking about her dad. And she realizes, my brother shall know of it. So I thank you for your good counsel. Come, my coach, good ladies. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night, good night. Notice it's in prose. It's in the sort of not super organized way of thinking of prose, which makes sense in this case for Ophelia. And then she's talking to her very horrified brother, Gertrude and Claudius, and she says to her brother, handing him flowers and herbs, there's fennel for you and columbines, rue for you, here's some for me. We may call it herb grace a Sundays. You must wear your rue with a difference. There's a daisy. I'd give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. They say he made a good end. You can look up the symbolism of these flowers, but I would just, on the first, and then she sings at the end. A basic, obvious question is, do you think she's really crazy? And different film versions suggest this. The Brana suggests very subtly that she's faking it, kind of like Hamlet does, which is interesting. But clearly her response to losing her dad is different than Laertes's. And I think that's a good starting point. But she's broken. We see her brokenness here up close. And these are just little snippets of her brokenness. Then the act gets even crazier. A sailor gives Horatio a letter. Now, Hamlet has been gone with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern on their way to England. Horatio reads the letter. It's Act 4, Scene 6, starting in line 12. This is from Hamlet. Horatio, when thou shalt have overlooked this, give these fellows some means to the king. They have letters for him. So Hamlet's saying, let these sailors talk to the king. Before we were 2 days old at sea, a pirate, a very warlike appointment, gave us chase. Finding ourselves too slow of sail, we put on a compelled valor, and in the grapple I boarded them. On the instant they got clear of our ship, so I alone became their prisoner. Hamlet is a pirate prisoner. They've dealt with me like thieves of mercy, but they know what they did. I am to do a good turn for them. So Hamlet evidently made a deal with the pirates. Let the king have the letters I've sent, and repair thou to me with as much speed as thou wouldst fly death. I have words to speak in thine ear which will make thee dumb. They'll take your speech away, right? And Horatio likes to talk. These good fellows will bring you where I am. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern hold their course for England. Of them I have much to tell thee. Farewell, he that knowest thine. Hamlet. So we get some plot covered by this letter. I'm imagining that there really wasn't, it would have been pretty tricky staging this at the Globe Theater. So this is a way to get that information across. So Laertes and Claudius meet. Interestingly, Claudius's right-hand man was Laertes' dad. Now he has Laertes. So Claudius, they're talking, and Claudius gets a note, is interrupted, and gets a note from a servant, also from Hamlet. High and mighty. You can see the smirk right under those words. You shall know I am set naked on your kingdom. He's not literally naked. He just doesn't have like a group of soldiers and stuff with him. Tomorrow shall I beg leave to see your kingly eyes. Again, snarky. When I shall, first asking your pardon thereunto, recount the occasion of my sudden and more strange return. Hamlet. And Claudius asks Laertes to advise him. He says, what should this mean? Are all the rest come back, or is it some abuse and no such thing? Is this like, is he lying to me? Is this written by somebody else? And they go back and forth. And it turns out they craft two ways to end Hamlet's life. So after Claudius sort of spurs him on, Laertes says, I will do it. For that purpose, I'll anoint my sword. Now we know Laertes spent time in France, and he says this line, I bought an unction of a mountebank. This is why previewing these acts before watching a film version or listening to an audio drama or something is helpful, because I bought an unction of a mountebank. No one's going to know what that means. And it's really important because Laertes bought an unction, a potion, a poison, off like a street salesman. That's what this means. And he said, the unction is so mortal that dip but a knife in it, where it draws blood, no cataplasm so rare, collected from all simples that have virtue under the moon, can save the thing from death that is but scratched withal. So if I dip my sword into this potion and touch Hamlet with it, he dies. I'll touch my point with this contagion, that if I gall him slightly, it may be death. So there's a plan to use his sword. The part of this conversation I'm not discussing is Claudius saying that Hamlet was always jealous of Laertes' sword fighting ability, and maybe they can stage a sword fight. And this is where Laertes has this idea: I have this poison, it's perfect. I'll kill him with it during the sword fight. Claudius says, and I always wonder if this is literally overkill. Claudius says, and this is another good example of watching a character think. Iago does this a few times in Othello. Hamlet does it a lot. This is Claudius. It feels improvisational almost. He says, let's further think of this. Weigh what convenience, both of time and means, may fit us to our shape. And here's his concern. If this should fail, if your plan with dipping your sword in this unction should fail, and that our drift look through our bad performance, 'twere better not essayed. So if you fail at this, it's better that we didn't even do it. Therefore, this project should have a backup plan. We should have a back or second that might hold if this should blast and proof. So he says, let's have a backup plan. And then he says, soft, let me see. We'll make a solemn wager on your cunnings. I have it. When in your motion you are hot and dry, and make your bouts more violent to that end, and he calls for drink, I'll have prepared for him a chalice for the nonce, whereon but sipping, if he by chance escape your venom stuck, our purpose may hold there. In other words, I'll have a poisoned cup that if you fight with him really violently, he's going to get tired and thirsty. I give him the cup, he dies that way. It's a two-part plan to kill Hamlet. the scene it's a really interesting conversation, really between two men who haven't done this, right? Claudius and Polonius were this to each other, advisors, but it's really interesting how Claudius sort of baits Laertes on. And then Act 4 ends with this heartbreaking, shocking, maybe shocking interruption. Gertrude interrupts them and says that Ophelia is dead. And they ask her what happened. Well, Laertes, just kind of repeats himself and is sort of all flummoxed, dead, dead. She says this beautiful speech about it, and I never know what to make of it. She says, Gertrude says, there's a willow grows aslant a brook that shows her hoary leaves in a glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she come of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. So Ophelia goes to this brook, this lake, with all these sort of ornamental flowers that she's created for herself. There on the pendant boughs her coronet weeds clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke, where down her weedy trophies and herself fell into the weeping brook. She falls into the brook, her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like awhile they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element, but long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious song to muddy death. That's a long way of saying Ophelia jumped in a lake and died. So I would ask this question: why do you think this revelation is placed at the end of Act 4 during this conversation between Laertes and Claudius? And why spend so much time talking about it? Why paint this vivid picture? And I've always wondered too, if somebody was there listening to her sing, why didn't they go dive in and save her? I always wondered that. But anyway, it's this really beautiful lyric end of Act 4 that's really heartbreaking. So just some things to think about when it comes to maybe doing some writing or discussing of Act 4. Do you think Ophelia's death, Ophelia spelled correctly preferably, was suicide? And is Claudius using Laertes, or are they a team now? And I always think it's good to make predictions. So the climax of the play is pointing in this direction. A, Hamlet's awkward return home. Lots has happened in a few days. And B, Laertes and Claudius's plot to kill Hamlet by staging a fencing match, and there's poison in two places and all that. Make some predictions about Act 5. Even if you haven't read lots of Shakespearean tragedy, there's always characters making certain plans, and then to some extent they come true, and to some extent they have to improv, and to some extent other characters interfere. So make some predictions about Act 5 and discuss those predictions with your class. So good luck with your reading and watching, and tell me what you think in the comments. Thank you.